Good morning, my friends. Today, it's a very beautiful, snowy day. A lot of snow on the ground. Nice, big, fat, white clumps of snowflakes falling from the sky. It's nice to see. For the past, I'd say 2, 3 weeks, we've had pretty terrible weather in terms of just aesthetic and appeal. It's just what would typically happen, especially around Christmas. It happened was like it would start off with some snow. It would be around 0 degrees Celsius, and we'd get a little bit of snow falling, and then all of a sudden the temperature would start to rise to around 2, 3 degrees, and that would just turn into rain. And then, so basically, all the snow that you might have had prior, a few hours before, would eventually just be completely washed away. And then it would, so it would just be like, basically, it would look like it was March and it was raining and it was cold, which is not a fun combination. Then the next day, it would drop in temperature by about like 15 degrees. So then it was like minus 15 the next day. So all of that rain freezes. It's brutally cold. There's no snow on the ground. So it's just miserable. You can't even have the satisfaction of having some nice snow to look at, a nice winter wonderland landscape as we all sort of want during Christmas time. It sort of all just vanishes and it becomes this weird, desolate, frozen landscape of, just mud and dirt, and you're slipping all over the place and you're freezing your ass off. So it's nice to finally see outside just normal winter weather where it's just snowing. It's relatively cold out, but not too cold. I don't know actually how cold it is, but generally it can't be too cold because once it's gets really cold out, the snow sort of just doesn't exist anymore. It tends to be a happen once it gets to like the minus 15 region. Snow or just moisture in the air just sort of like dissipates into the infinite, and it just becomes sunny outside, which is if you're living in a colder climate, you definitely know what I'm talking about. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a suggestion that someone offered. There's not really much to talk about, but I'll go ahead. It was a suggestion and I'll follow through with it. This is a suggestion about cartoons. Cartoons were actually a very big part of my life growing up when I was a kid. They were definitely something I collected a lot of. I used to buy those big sort of comic or cartoon books of various comics. The first one I think I really got into, well, I guess we could start with comic book heroes. Cartoons and comics are a little bit different. Cartoons are something you see in the Sunday paper. Comics are actually like comic books you buy at a store. But comics is what I started off with. I was a huge fan of Spider-Man and of Marvel comics. I never really got into the DC universe as a kid. I was strictly Marvel, more specifically, strictly Spider-Man for the most part. Spider-Man was my favorite hero at that time. For what reasons, I'm not entirely sure. I was only 4 or 5 years old, but he was definitely my favorite superhero and still is to this day. Although I'm not really much into superhero concepts lately. I know there's a new Spider-Man movie that came out. I haven't seen it. I've heard really good things about it. The Spider-Man universe type of thing. It's an animation sort of deal. One day I'll probably go see it. I just haven't really gotten around to it. It's kind of expensive to go see movies nowadays. So I don't really find myself doing it that often, but I'll do it if I'm with a group of friends, and if we're all doing it, it's sort of a fun experience. But just doing it by myself, I kind of don't really do that much. It's kind of not a fun thing for me. but we're talking about cartoons now. And cartoons, I started to get into. I don't know if people have this in America or around the world, but in at least Canada, we have this thing called Scholastic. I don't know if they even still exist anymore, but it would basically be this group of, whatever. They would come to schools and they would sell, discounted books to kids. So I forget what it was exactly, but anyway, I got the pamphlet and there was a thing for like a really like big sale for like the entire collection of Calvin and Hobbes. I had no idea what Calvin and Hobbes was. I think I was around 7 or 8. And my mom sort of was like ecstatic. She was really excited about it because she obviously knew what it was. Although I'm not entirely sure the events. I was really young, so my memory's not as strong as it would be if I was a little older. But I do remember that there was a big sale in terms of owning the entire collection of Calvin and Hobbes, so she got it. And that was when it sort of arrived in the mail in this massive box, and there was like all these books of Calvin and Hobbes. It was a huge collection, and it spans 10 years of work from what's his name? Bill Waters, is that his name? So anyway, that was the first cartoon I really got into, and that sort of, changed my perspective of cartoons and sort of changed my perspective on life. I really got into Calvin and Hobbes. It was a very sort of growing up experience, I guess, to sort of be able to read all those books. And, I really love Calvin and Hobbes, and I still do. I still read it to this day every once in a while, not as much as I used to, obviously. When I was a kid, I didn't really read novels or that such. I read a series of unfortunate events. That was sort of my first novel I actually got into. But before that, it was all Calvin and Hobbes, all cartoons, and I got into other cartoons. I got into Garfield at one point. Like early Garfield, and then Foxtrot was another one. This cartoon called Zitz. Get Fuzzy was another one I got into. So anyway, there was a whole lot of different cartoons that I was into. If we're talking about TV, like cartoon shows, that was a different kind of thing, but I was still very much into. It has a different sort of effect, I think, on you as a kid when you're reading it versus watching it. The cartoons I watched definitely affected me, but it was a different experience of which I don't really know how to explain. I think with reading a cartoon, it was a much more personal experience because you're experiencing it on your own terms. You're imagining the voices in your head on your own terms. The action, the movement of the characters are sort of happening in your own imagination, so the written format definitely expands your imagination a little bit. That's not to say there's nothing wrong with TV version of cartoons. It's just a different experience. As a kid, definitely as a late millennial, early Gen Z, I was very heavily into SpongeBob, as most people were at that time, I think. I don't know many people who are my age demographic who have never at least watched SpongeBob. So that was the biggest one I was into, and I actually watched a lot of adult cartoons when I was really young, mostly due to my sister, who is 6 or 7 years older than me, and she would watch like Family Guy and South Park and The Simpsons, and I would sort of watch that as well, and my parents sort of barely allowed it for me. One of the things I remember though with South Park was that my mom was very much against me watching it. For what reason, I'm not entirely sure. She would let me watch Family Guy or, The Simpsons or I don't know, typical adult humor, but South Park she very much was against, me watching it until I think I was like 15. She didn't want it in the house for whatever reason. To this day, I'm not entirely sure why. But yeah, those were the cartoons I watched. Um, anyway, there's not really much else to say about cartoons. They're definitely an important aspect of a kid's life, I think. I think it's more relevant towards boys versus girls. Boys, I think, tend to sort of tend to be attracted more towards cartoons than girls. Not to say that girls aren't either, but I think just in terms of the escapism and the fantasy that cartoons provide is definitely more inviting towards younger boys, which I think is an interesting aspect to go into. I'm actually watching Dragon Ball for the first time. I've never actually sat down and watched the series ever. I've watched, I think, one episode before in my childhood, and I thought it was pretty good, but I was never really into anime as a kid. I never really was into like action so much, like action narrative driven cartoons. I was mostly into the lighter, sort of funnier cartoons, which is kind of why I stopped reading superhero comic books after the age of 6. So I got more into the lighter stuff. So anyway, that's all I have to say, and I hope you have a wonderful day.